I'll come clean with you all. I'm not a fan of the horror genre. I played RE2 Remake last year and it took me way too long to make it to the second floor of the RPD station. Peeking down to see Mr. X coming up after me into a new area made me quit the game without thinking twice. The rocket launcher in the chest looked tempting, but at that point, why even bother? So how come I'm telling you to play Termina? Such a recommendation is a little shocking to my younger self, and funnily enough, Termina reminds me of one of the few Resident Evil games I liked playing growing up. Outbreak File 2. It's a game with a cast of playable characters where the ones you don't choose go around the world doing their thing and offer you a helping hand every now and then. It has a beautiful lush forest, which was my favorite, a few stalker enemies like this guy with the axe, and the typical Resident Evil puzzle progression. Not to mention, both have a crazy elephant that tries to kill you. I never managed to finish most levels in Outbreak as a kid, but I liked it a lot anyway. It had this feeling where the world is happening around you, not for you. You could very well just sit in your place and wait for your end while everyone else attempts to survive. I found that very intriguing, but I was oblivious to the fact it was a byproduct of the game's multiplayer nature. Playing through Termina and seeing everything I mentioned above did remind me of Outbreak, but they couldn't be more different. Though I have to admit, these menus look a little retro. Wasn't feeling them for a while, but they grew on me. To understand how someone who isn't into survival horror of any kind could recommend such a game, we need a little backstory. Please do abide by the warning on screen. If you're uncomfortable with these topics, this series isn't for you. I'll try not to show anything intense, but you have been warned. Like many of us, I watched this video and got hooked. I could never justify playing such a game because of the time investment. I had just finished my spree of Elden Ring challenges and I wasn't looking forward to more agony. But something about the game kept beckoning me. The depths of the dungeon and their horror was immensely alluring. And so I started binge-watching videos made by these guys. I've now seen all their important lore videos, and I even watched this 16-hour stream not too long ago. Eventually, I knew so much about the game without ever stepping foot into the dungeon. At that point, it felt more than doable, so I finally did it. Don't make the same mistake I made. I spoiled too much about how the game works, and while the first few hours were very fun and scary, a lot of tension was gone. Looming death became a looming inconvenience. Instead, arm yourself with some basic knowledge and don't outright kill the mystery. While the journey that got me here was immensely fascinating, I traded it for something a little more special. It's remarkable how, despite the fact I'm armed with all the knowledge you need to shred the game open, I still feel the pressure of the never-ending darkness that lurks within the dungeon. It's hard to put into words, and that might be the best compliment I can pay right now. It's heavy, it's memorable, it's ball-bustingly difficult, and it has a lot of crude charm and penetrating atmosphere, even if I approached it in a polarizing way. I want to shine a quick spotlight on present-day Mahab. It's absolutely haunting. And it reminds me of the present-day segments in Prince of Persia: Warrior Within. Maybe I'll make a video on that game in the future. For now, I had Termina, and I made sure not to make the same mistake again. You're thrown into a battle royale instigated in a shared dream by Rare, the trickster moon god. You play as one of 8 characters, each with their own distinct backstories and abilities which you get to influence. As you board the train headed for Prohival, you find yourself lost in a nostalgic daydream of the journey that brought you here. The gentle rhythm of the railway tracks under you creates the perfect melodic backdrop for you to reflect on your story. The choices you make will dictate what skills you start with. How will you train as a boxer? What practices will you focus on as a yellow mage? Will you go on a suicide mission as a child soldier? Or will you try to steal the affection of the professor from your twin sister? That kind of thing. The characters are a big deal in Termina. They're a prominent part of both gameplay and story in many different ways, and they're perhaps the part that will stick with you the most over the course of the game. I started as the boxer Marco. He lived as an orphan in the Vatican City with his sister. Eventually, he built a name for himself in underground boxing rings, which caught the attention of the mafia. One person in particular, named Ricardo, got into a relationship with his sister, which was their way out of poverty. It was also Marco's ticket into legit boxing rings with personal trainers and proper gyms. Marco had to accept the offer against his better judgment after refusing to be his bodyguard. But one day, Ricardo approached him and made him an offer he couldn't refuse. Tonight, kill your opponent in the ring, or your sister will be in danger. Marco had no other choice. Overcome with guilt and frustration, he made sure his sister was out of harm's way and killed Ricardo, becoming a wanted criminal and escaping town. The train stops in the middle of his journey to reunite with his sister. As a playable character, Marco is very good, especially for beginners. His fists outperform most early game weapons and he has excellent survivability. But what does it mean to survive in Termina? Wandering the world, you'll have to deal with enemies that can cut off your limbs, inflict status effects, and beat you down hard. Outside battles, you'll have to keep yourself sane and fed, which doesn't tend to be a big problem. The real challenge in Termina comes in the form of puzzle-like enemies and managing your limited chances to save. Every encounter can be the end of a run. When you've made hours of progress and you get caught out in the open by an unknown threat, it can get very tense. You don't know if you have what it takes to take them down, and even if you do, you don't know if you have the resources to recover after the fight. Take these headless hounds for example. They're not particularly strong, but they will chip you down and poison you. The poison can be cured by white vials, typically found in fridges for some reason. But next to them you might also find rotten meat. If you're a keen player, you might see where this is going. Here's an important tip. If an item has an interaction with an enemy, it's usable through the talk command. In this case, throwing the hound's meat will pacify them for 2 turns, allowing you to take them out safely. There are a lot of enemies like this, and even if there isn't a specific interaction that can pacify them, you still need to apply the same puzzle-solving mentality through the universal game mechanics to come out alive. Yes, enemies can dismember you, denying you important abilities with each lost limb, but this goes both ways. Cut the right arm of the woodsman and he can't use his axe anymore. Cut the legs of this crazy villager and she'll lose her balance, making her head vulnerable and making her crawl in the overworld if you decide to spare her. Besides dismemberment, there's bleeding, burning, concussion, and blindness, all of which goes both ways. If an enemy is too strong in one way or another, you ought to outsmart them, not just use brute force, although you can build around that as well. To inflict those status effects, you use spells, items, and traps, but sometimes running away will be your best option. Even with those tools at your disposal, you're likely not familiar with the enemy's weaknesses. But run away too much and every corner of the map will have danger lurking around it. I was watching the stream of Super Eyebach Wolf and everywhere he went there was something coming after his throat. The elaborate layout of Preheval allows you to find alternate routes around enemies, and even then I do recommend you try to learn them and become stronger. But there is a charm to finding your way through the many nooks and crannies of the city, along with the sewer tunnels which cover a massive part of it. Something I feel I should touch on is luck. It's a real part of Termina. You could beat the game under rough circumstances, but get lucky dumpster diving or opening a chest, and you might find accessories that can greatly aid your survival. A recurring theme for me on my first runs in both Fear and Hunger games is finding the Ring of Wraiths early, which heals you every turn. In the first game, if you try to break a door in a fight and just wasted your turn, the ring procs, giving you a free full heal if you were a little patient. In Termina, that was patched out, but I had an idea. If you completely dismember a basic enemy, they become harmless, letting me abuse the ring to full effect. I felt like such a genius when I made this discovery, and I was reminded of it every time I passed by the crazy villager crawling after me in the slums. Luck is a thing to be reckoned with, especially with chests. God knows just how many chest coin tosses I failed. Sometimes it feels like the game is rigged, but when it does work, I end up getting a wooden shield. As a newcomer, it's gonna be hard to know if you're getting unlucky. Things like strong rings, skin bibles, and recipe books can make all the difference, but you'd have no idea. Don't worry about it too much, and try to make the best of what you have. All of this can sound brutal, but it comes with a worthwhile trade-off. Seeing a death mask get up out of a coffin and blitz after you for the first time is a great moment, and their overwhelming strength and terrifying presence make your future victories over them all the more gratifying. This cruelty only serves to make your survival in the world of Termina that much more meaningful, and it's accentuated by music that plays with tension perfectly. The world manages to be memorable despite the simplistic RPG Maker visuals too. I'm part of the crowd that hates crude saving mechanics, but it's easy to see how it works in the favor of Termina. Even though your saving chances are limited, they're just the right amount. In the first game, if you cleared an area of enemies, sleeping at the beds becomes safe, making them infinitely reusable. Once I discovered that, the game lost something precious. In Termina, sleeping progresses time. After the night of day 3, you'll moonscorch, turning into a monster. This makes it so that you have 8 guaranteed saves over the course of 3 days, segmented into morning, evening, and night. But this isn't your only way to record your progress. You can also use one of the divine circles to draw a sigil using chalk and pray to a specific god to save at their statue. Though the right circles are finite with another alluring use, and the statue cracks after you pray to it, but it is a much needed reprieve that doesn't progress time. If you're lucky, rummaging through bookshelves will grant you a Book of Enlightenment, a portable one-time save you can use whenever you want. It all comes together to maintain the tension between every point, something the first game loses very quickly if you know what you're doing. Some of you might raise an eyebrow over the 3-day limit. Wandering around the slums will show you how Rare treats the people who refuse to partake in the festival. Their skin burns and itches inside out. The unbearable pain prompted those people to peel it off. They're what the game calls moon-scorched. The moon god did not allow them to escape the grasp of the festival, and neither will he let you. The 3-day period has a lot of events scattered across it, depending on some conditions like the time of day and who's alive, enemies and contestants alike. Character recruitability, story events, contestant deaths, and moon-scorched status are all things that can shift around, making repeated playthroughs distinct. If you wanted to see everything Termina has to offer, you have to make several playthroughs. It can be a nerve-wracking experience sometimes, which helps the few moments of respite you get be a little more serene. Entering the train after the game kicks off is something most players don't bother with, but if you do, you're hit with a tranquil, slightly eerie safe room theme. Your party takes a little break, and you have 2 avenues of recording your progress. It's a shame it's used only here, but I guess that makes it more special. The Prehevel Bob Jazz Club is the spot most players would call home, and for good reason. It's a place that shelters you from the horrors of the city and sets you on a new adventure. It's more lively and cozy all around. Characters here exchange charming interactions and stories. It's always cool to come down here with different party members and see something new. A little extra glimpse into these lovable contestants. They all carry deep and relatable storylines filled with pain, sorrow, and anxiety. They hide their traumas well, though you can help some of them open up when they're at their lowest. Themes like loss of loved ones, guilt, body image issues, and the mental and physical hardships of disability are all themes familiar to us to some extent, but the way they're carried out and explored through these characters is worthy of praise. It would be remiss of me to gloss over Prehevel. Every corner tells you something about this world. Old Town was always a bad place, but Marina, who's a local, tells you it wasn't ever this bad and something odd is happening. The city itself is reminiscent of Yarnum, with coffins laying around in the streets and people locked up inside their homes by order of the church. I was lucky enough to go through it at night my first time around too. Places like the shopping district and the jazz club remind you of what life might have looked like before everything went insane. The moldy apartments spook the hell out of me, and the orphanage has a strong, somber mood with a soundtrack that persists even during fights, which is a nice touch. It's one of my favorite areas, even if I hate being there because it's so gloomy. All of this and much more is littered with environmental storytelling, and that doesn't mean just finding notes and journals scattered around. It extends to the things you see and fight and interact with. The thoughtfulness behind much of the game's lore and design is astonishing, especially considering it's mostly a solo project. There's a lot of tasteful references and commentary on real-world stories, personalities, and events, often with a twist. If you try to understand everything thoroughly, you'd end up going on several historical and mythological rabbit holes. Sometimes I'm taken aback by just how much creativity has gone into everything. I do have some critiques and suggestions. Feel free to pause if you want to read them, although be mindful of the spoilers they might carry. Needless to say, I've had a great time with Termina despite being someone who doesn't play any kind of horror games and who hates turn-based combat with a passion. I couldn't recommend it enough. What about the first game? Do you need to play it to get into Termina? I wouldn't say it's absolutely necessary, but it can greatly enhance your experience with Termina. They both have their own distinct appeal, with the first boasting an interconnected world with impressive verticality, a heavier atmosphere, and being generally more of a survival horror game, but it is quite crude in some spots, which is part of its charm. Meanwhile, Termina is much more approachable to new players, for better or for worse. Both games can be very brutal going in blind, so consider watching some beginner content, and don't be afraid of asking for help in the official Discord. The people on the Termina channel are very cool, and the Vile theory goes unbelievably hard. That's about it for now. Thank you for watching.